Hi, everybody. I'm Therese Allen, and I've invited my friend Patty Barr here to help me with my project for Module 2 for psychology. Um, she's she's going to ask me some questions, and then I'll give her answers. So it's a kind of a mock interview. All right, Patty?
Okay. Therese, why is studying the nervous system important?
Well, Patty, our nervous system is important in everything that we are and everything that we do. It's thanks to our nervous system that we can see and feel and smell and taste and hear the world around us. It controls our movements and responses to everything we perceive. It enables us to think and speak and dance and have this conversation right now. In fact, scientists study the nervous system, especially the brain, to get a better understanding of why we act and feel the way we do.
Oh, well, you mentioned the brain. Now, is that part of the nervous system?
Yes, the brain is part of the nervous system. There are actually two major parts of the nervous system: the central nervous system, and that consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the other parts of the nervous system, even right down to the tips of our fingers and toes. Now, the central nervous system is the part that receives and processes and interprets and stores all of the incoming sensory information. It also sends out messages to muscles and glands and organs. Now, the brain is protected by the skull, and the spinal cord extends down from the base of the brain down the center of the back. It's protected by the spinal column. Now, the other major part, the peripheral nervous system, is actually divided into two major parts itself: the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic system connects to sensory receptors and skeleton muscles. It lets us do all of our voluntary movements, like touching you right now. The autonomic system, on the other hand, regulates things like the blood vessels, glands, and all our internal organs. To take it one step farther, the autonomic system itself is divided into two parts: the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system, which work in balance with each other. The sympathetic system kind of kicks everything up into gear when it's a time of stress or strong emotion. The parasympathetic system slows everything down when the danger is past.
Oh. Well, can you tell me about some other parts of the nervous system? Like, what are neurons, for instance, and how do cells communicate?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because a neuron is a nerve cell, and it's the basic unit of the nervous system. It conducts electrochemical signals. The other cells called glia hold or other cells called glia hold the neurons in place, and they feed it and nourish it and insulate it. A neuron has three basic parts: the axon, the dendrites, and the cell body. The interesting thing is neurons don't ever actually touch each other. When they're transmitting signals, their ends are separated by a thing called the synaptic cleft, which is a tiny space in between where the axon of one nerve uh, nearly touches the dendrites of the other. And that whole area is what we call the synapse. Now, you asked about neurons and how they communicate. Neurons communicate through chemical and electrical changes. There's a brief change in electrical voltage that creates an action potential when a neuron is stimulated. It's what produces the electrical impulse. There are three main types of chemical messengers in the nervous system. We have neurotransmitters, hormones, and neuromodulators.
Well, what can you tell me about mapping the brain?
Well, scientists have tried to figure out what parts of the brain control different functions. And so they've looked at it in two ways. One approach is to um, do something to the brain and then see what kind of effect that has on behavior. And then in the other one, they manipulate a behavior and then see if they can find where that's what's going on in the brain when that's happening. Now, for manipulating the brain, scientists have used something called the lesion method, where they disable or remove a part of the brain and then see how behavior changes. Now, understand this is not ever done on humans, it's only on non human animals. And then there are two other kinds of uh, tests that they use. One is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and that's when they use a strong magnetic field um, on their on their head to temporarily stimulate uh, some part of the brain. And then the third one is transcranial direct current stimulation. And in there, they just apply a very small electrical current to a certain area of the brain. Now, that other approach I was talking about, manipulating behavior and then observing the brain, they use electroencephalograph to measure certain potentials. They also use PET scans and MRIs and something even more advanced called functional MRIs.
Oh, okay. Can you describe the brain to me?
I can try.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so we're going to start with the brain stem. All right. In the brain stem, we have the pons, which is involved in sleeping and waking and dreaming. And then we also have the medulla, which controls bodily functions that are automatic, like breathing and your heart rate. Then there's another area called the reticular activating system, which is a dense network of neurons that arouses the cortex and screens incoming information. Then at the base of the brain, there's the cerebellum, which controls balance and helps muscles to move easily. And deep in the center of the brain lies the thalamus, which relays sensory information to the cerebral cortex. Then beneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which really is the big boss of the body. It helps maintain the homeostasis or the steady state through things such as regulating your body temperature. Then hanging down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, or the master gland of the body. It releases hormones and sends messages to other glands. Then we also have the amygdala, which is located deep in the temporal lobe beneath the temples. It assesses dangers in the environment, so it's considered the fear center of the brain. And we also have the hippocampus, which is really important in creating new memories. The cerebrum then is divided into two hemispheres, and it controls most of the sensory, motor, and cognitive processes. The two halves of cerebrum are connected by the corpus callosum. And then the cerebral cortex covers the cerebrum. It's several layers of densely packed cells. And there are four lobes in each of those hemispheres: the occipital, the parietal, the temporal, and the frontal. Did that answer your question?
More than probably I needed to know, but it's interesting.
Yes.
Okay, well, I have heard a lot about right brain and left brain differences. So, can you tell me anything about the two hemispheres that might explain that?
Well, yeah, it is true that each hemisphere has its own area of specialization. For instance, the left hemisphere seems to really like to control language and reading and symbolic gestures, describing things in order. That's the left brain speaking. The right hemisphere seems to control recognizing faces, identifying expressions, or understanding music and
Oh,
art.
okay.
So, so you and I really like that because we like to sing.
Yes.
So,
Huh.
and then some observations of split brain people, people who have no connection between the two halves for some reason, have proven to be really helpful in understanding what side of the brain really controls a function. But it's really important to remember that in normal people, the two halves work together really well. They function together as one, and they contribute to the whole
Oh,
person.
well, that makes sense. Do our brains change during our lifetimes?
Yes, Patty, they do. Our brains are amazing at adapting to different challenges, and there's a thing called neurogenesis. People think sometimes that our brains can't grow, but they can, and they can reorganize connections if there's damage done to a brain. This is called plasticity. It just has an amazing power to adapt to injury, and it's what helps stroke victims recover, uh, even from paralysis to sometimes they can regain some use of their limbs. Sometimes it can allow blind people to kind of see music in a way that those of us who aren't blind may never understand. It's just really important that we remember that the brain really is a living, dynamic organ.
Wow, thank you, Therese. I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being part of this with me.
Sure.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. You didn't say your